The alien child was burned to death in the hot desert, until a human appeared. The sun never truly set on Valdar 9, a forgotten desert moon whose surface cracked and screamed beneath twin suns that hung like cruel, unblinking eyes in a blood-orange sky, where nothing native grew taller than a thorned shrub and the wind carried the sharp sting of pulverized mineral and scorched salt. It was not a place meant for life, and certainly not a place where a child should have awakened alone, half buried in the debris of a failing escape pod that had once been a cradle of last hopes and final prayers, now a melted relic blistering in the sand, its once smooth hull warped from impact and sun exposure, and the air around it warping slightly from sheer ambient heat, as if the planet itself were trying to burn the evidence of her existence from the universe. Alaya, barely 6 solar cycles old and born beneath the soft light of Lorien Theta's ocean moons, had never felt heat like this, nor the unbearable dryness that cracked her translucent skin and made her breath come out in sharp rasps like paper, tearing in a vacuum. She had no memory of how long she'd been lying there, no sense of how many hours or days had passed since the escape pod had plummeted from orbit with a dying mother's sobbed instructions echoing in her ears. Don't cry, don't move, don't speak until someone finds you. Someone kind, someone human. But no one had come. Not until now. Her webbed fingers, perfect for the deep currents of her native waters, had curled into claws trying to dig through the baking topsoil in search of cooler ground, only to find more heat, more dust, more pain. Her eyes, wide and rimmed with the star-speckled irises of her people, had blurred until the light itself danced and shimmered like liquid metal, and the only sounds she could hear were the wheezing of her own lungs and the eerie, empty howl of the desert wind scraping over metal and stone. The desert did not show mercy. The desert erased. The twin suns bore down with merciless indifference, casting her tiny body into sharp relief on the sand. Scorch marks on her knees, the pads of her feet blistered and peeling from her attempt to crawl toward the distant rise she thought might hold water or shelter or simply some shadow she could curl into and die quietly. Every breath hurt. Her throat had long since ceased to produce sound. She had tried to call out in her native tongue, then in garbled common, but her words had evaporated into nothing before they could carry. The escape pod had been too damaged to transmit a distress signal. Its power source had ruptured in the landing, and even the emergency beacon had blinked once before sputtering into silence. She had water pouches, 4, rationed for a week's survival, but the last had dried up 2 nights ago, and now even the thought of moisture felt like a cruel memory. Her lips cracked every time she tried to mouth the word, Mama. She didn't know if her mother had survived. She didn't know if any of her people had. What she knew was the slow, precise agony of a body shutting down, organs beginning to fail, skin no longer able to protect itself, thoughts breaking into static as the brain tried to conserve what little function it had left. But even as her mind dimmed, some instinct refused to let go. Some primal core of will that her species had honed across centuries of exile and war. Some echo of the bloodline that had crossed galaxies to escape extinction. Her hands twitched. Her legs convulsed. And then she stilled, laid flat beside the melted wreckage of the pod. Her eyes open to the furnace sky, unblinking, pupils blown wide in the glare. She thought she saw a shape. At first she thought it was death, or perhaps a hallucination. One of the many spirits her mother used to whisper about, ancestors who would appear at the moment of passing and carry you gently into the next sea. But the shape did not drift. It stomped. It kicked up sand. It cast a shadow that blotted out the sun for just a moment, and then she felt something impossible. Cool. Not truly cold, but cooler than the burning ground. She tried to focus. The shape was tall, bipedal, wrapped in layers of dark cloth and sun-resistant armor plating that gleamed matte against the light. A visor blinked. A hand reached out. She flinched, not from fear, but from the shock of movement, and her breath seized in her lungs as a voice, low and rough but unmistakably human, murmured something she couldn't understand. The hand didn't touch her at first. It hovered, gauging. Then it slid beneath her shoulders, warm and calloused but firm, and lifted her into the crook of an arm. Her skin screamed at the contact, but her mind was too far gone to resist. The shape was moving now, fast, uneven strides across the dune toward some hulking form she couldn't make out. A structure? A vehicle? She felt vibrations through his chest as he spoke again, angling his head toward her face, trying to coax a response. But her eyes had shut. Her body sagged like wet cloth. In her fading awareness, she heard the hiss of a pressurized door, the cooler kiss of filtered air, and then the gentle splash of water being poured. Her lips were cracked too badly to open on their own, but a drop was touched to them, and another. The taste was metallic and strange, but it was wet. As a sob shuddered through her chest, and then she slipped into a black sleep so deep it felt like drowning. But for the first time in hours, in days, she didn't feel like she was dying. She didn't feel like she was alone. Somewhere beneath her consciousness, she recognized the shape from her mother's whispered bedtime stories. Not a ghost, not an ancestor, but a savior from another world. A human. Just one. But maybe that was all it took. And as the crawler rumbled forward into the dunes, shielding her from the storm, the desert behind her swallowed the wreckage whole, as if it had never been there at all. Elias Rain had always hated heat, the kind of suffocating, flesh-tight heat that stuck to your bones and made even your thoughts sweat. But it was the only currency Valdar 9 offered, the only thing reliable in this hellish corner of the system where the suns never slept and the desert sand could melt skin off steel if you didn't tread carefully. His sandcrawler, a rusted, growling beast patched together from 3 different junker models and at least 1 stolen military-grade solar converter, rumbled beneath him as he scanned the horizon, following a beacon signature that had flickered weakly for 2 days and then gone dark just as abruptly. Like a dying star gasping its last, scavengers like him learned not to question why a signal stopped, only to find it first before someone else did, because sometimes it meant scrap, sometimes it meant tech, and sometimes, on the rare days the galaxy turned sentimental, it meant a soul still clinging to life by fingernails and instinct. He didn't expect a child. Certainly not an alien child. He didn't even see her at first. Just the jagged carcass of an escape pod half sunken into the dunes, its hull warped and oxidized to a dull violet sheen, the entry hatch half blown out, and the emergency beacon scorched into a melted stub of useless metal. And when he stepped down, sweat already stinging his eyes beneath the layers of desert wear and his visor flickering with thermal static, it wasn't her face he saw, but a small hand curled unnaturally beside the blackened panel, so still he almost mistook it for part of the debris. But that hand moved, just once. A twitch, almost imperceptible. Elias swore under his breath and dropped to his knees, sand hissing around him like a live wire. And that was when he saw her. Slender, almost weightless, curled in on herself like a broken seed pod, skin so pale it had turned a sickly blue-gray in places. And when he reached to touch her shoulder, her body flinched as if even kindness burned. Her eyes opened just a sliver, unfocused and shining faintly with a star-like shimmer he'd never seen before. And he didn't wait for protocol or identification. He scooped her into his arms, and even though she barely weighed as much as his equipment pack the moment her body pressed against his, he knew how close to death she was, how much the desert had already claimed. Her skin was hot, wrongly hot like a body boiling from the inside, and though she didn't speak, the rasp of her breath was broken, shallow and terrifyingly fragile. Elias ran. The sand fought him every step, sliding beneath his boots like living things trying to pull him under, and the heat shimmered around them in waves, warping the world into a blur of reds and golds, until he reached the crawler's ramp and shoved his way inside, sealing the hatch with a clang that echoed like thunder in the silence that followed. Inside, the temperature dropped by 30 degrees instantly, and the filtered air recycled with a soft whoosh. But even in the cooler cabin, the child didn't stir. He laid her on his cot, ripped open his med pack, and began applying coolant, gel to her burns with hands that had stitched field wounds and loaded rifles but never touched a child. Not like this. She didn't cry. She didn't move. But when he raised a water bulb to her lips and let the liquid drip slowly, she responded. Just barely, tongue flicking out instinctively to catch it, and then again a little stronger, It wasn't enough, but it was something. It was life. He didn't ask himself why he cared. Not yet. The answer would come later. For now, he did what training and instinct told him. Rehydrate, lower the core body temperature, monitor vitals, and keep her breathing. She had no ID tag, no translator implant, nothing but a thin silver collar with etched markings in a language he only half recognized. Lorian script, maybe, or one of the offshoot dialects from the outer colonies. Her species, he couldn't even name it, was aquatic, clearly. Maybe evolved in deep-sea environments given the gill-like structures along her neck and the webbing between her fingers. That explained the burns. Her physiology wasn't designed for a place like Valdar 9. No one's really was. He sat by her side for hours, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest, listening to the crawler hum gently around them, shielding them both from the relentless wrath outside. It wasn't until night, what passed for night anyway, a dull amber dimming of the smaller sun, that she finally moved again. Her fingers twitched, her eyes fluttered. And this time when she opened them, they locked onto his face. Not confused, not frightened, but alert in a way that startled him. She was awake, and she was watching. "Hey," he said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe. Can you understand me?" She didn't answer, but her gaze didn't break. Then, slowly, painfully, she raised her hand and pointed to the side panel of the crawler, where his navigation screen still displayed the flickering echo of the beacon that had led him here. She tapped the screen once, then twice. He frowned, then nodded. "Yeah, I found your ship, not much left of it." Her mouth opened slightly, cracked and bleeding, and she rasped one word in a whisper that cut him to the core. "Mama." It was the only word she said for the rest of that night. He didn't push. He gave her more water, covered her burns, let her sleep. And when he stepped outside the next morning to scan the perimeter, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice, fresh tracks. Not his, not hers. Something had landed near the crash site in the night. A drone, maybe, or worse. He erased his crawler's trail and moved them 5 clicks north, deeper into the dunes. He buried the escape pod remains beneath a rock shelf and used a signal scrambler to mask their heat signature. Whoever was searching would need more than a scan to find them now. But the fact that someone was searching told him everything he needed to know. This girl, this child, wasn't just lost. She was being hunted. And for Elias Rain, former lieutenant of the Sovereign Fleet turned fringe scavenger and war exile, that meant only one thing. She mattered. And because she mattered, he would not let her go. The dunes never slept, and neither did Elias after. The third night, not truly. Not with the way the wind had started to shift, carrying with it scents and pulses that didn't belong to Valdar 9, ionized metal, faint ozone, the telltale prickling silence that preceded something mechanical drawing breath. And even as the girl began to stir more often, her strength returning, in fragile, uneven sips, Elias kept one hand on his weapon at all times, eyes flicking to the motion sensors that lined the crawler's undercarriage, waiting for the inevitable blip that would confirm what his instincts already screamed. Someone was closing in, and it wasn't rescue, because no one came to this wasteland to rescue anything unless they had a profit to reap or a secret to erase. The girl, now able to sit for brief moments, watched him silently with those strange, star-dappled eyes, tracking his every move with the eerie calm of a creature who had already seen death and knew it wore many faces. And though she still hadn't spoken more than a few whisper-thin words, "Mama," "thirst," "gone," the way she clutched the edge of his coat when the wind howled outside told him everything. She didn't just fear the desert. She feared what was in it or what might come from it. And Elias, hardened though he was, couldn't shake the sense that he'd stumbled into something far deeper than a lost child and a wrecked pod, that this girl wasn't just a passenger on a doomed escape. She was the reason it had been doomed, the reason her mother had launched her into the void while sacrificing herself to whatever threat followed. He thought of it often, that image, even though he hadn't seen it, only imagined the desperation of a parent pushing a child into an escape pod, programming coordinates manually, overriding safety limits, knowing the chances of survival were nearly zero, but doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. And now that weight sat on Elias's shoulders like the midday sun, heavy and searing, demanding purpose. The girl had no name, at least none she could pronounce or remember in her weakened state. So Elias, speaking gently into the warm hush of the crawler's cockpit, started calling her Soli, short for Solivara, a name from a dead Terran dialect, meaning sun's daughter because it seemed fitting, cruelly so, that a child of water should be scorched by two suns and yet survive. She didn't reject the name, merely blinked slowly when he spoke it, and one day, 3 dawns after her arrival, she pointed to herself and whispered, Soli, with a rasp so faint he thought he imagined it. But no, it was there. And when she said it again, firmer this time, he smiled despite himself, unaware how tightly the name had already wrapped itself around his heart like a wire, taut and irreversible. But the reprieve was brief, and the desert, as always, moved beneath them. Not sand alone, but something else, something watching. Elias first noticed the absence of birds. Desert crows, the only living scavengers besides him, had stopped circling, his crawler for scraps. The air was quieter, too quiet, and the temperatures had begun to spike irregularly, not the usual oven swell of Valdar 9's brutal midday, but bursts of artificial heat, localized, like engine wash flaring just beyond sensor range. At night he caught glimpses, reflections that didn't belong to stars, movements that left no tracks, a faint hum in the sand like a machine breathing in reverse. And he knew, without needing to check the registry, that what was hunting them wasn't native, wasn't random, and certainly wasn't human. He increased the crawler's stealth shielding, rotated their sleeping shifts, taught Soli to stay perfectly still and silent beneath the storage panel at the base of the cot, a tight space, barely large enough for her to curl up in. But she obeyed, her thin fingers never trembling, her face expressionless as he sealed the hatch. On the 6th day, the first drone came, black, angular, sleek as a stinger wasp, hovering low over the dunes at dawn, sensors glowing blue and scanning wide arcs across the sand. But Elias was ready, firing a decoy pulse into the opposite direction and setting off a magnetic mine that fried its circuits before it could transmit coordinates. He buried the wreckage under a shallow mound and moved again, deeper into the ragged spine of the salt dunes where the terrain interfered with aerial signals, and for a few hours he thought maybe, just maybe, they'd bought time. But Soli knew better, and one night as they shared the last ration of hydrofruit paste, she looked up at him and said, voice still raw but steadier now, "They don't stop." He asked her gently who they were. She shook her head, placed her palm over his chest where his heartbeat thrummed against his shirt, and simply said, "Bad ones." That was all she gave him. It was all he needed, because something in her eyes, older than a child's should be, weary in a way no 6-year-old should understand, told him the truth. Soli wasn't just running from a crash. She was running from a war, from something ancient and ruthless that had already taken everything else from her and now hunted what little remained. Elias, hardened soldier, outlawed scavenger, man of practical survival and zero attachments, found himself watching her sleep that night and thinking not about his own escape, but how to keep her alive, how to shield her, teach her, hide her until the stars turned cold. He sent encrypted pings to old allies, called in favors from ghosts he hadn't spoken to since the war. And most of all, he prepared, the way only a man who'd once held a burning front line for 87 straight hours could prepare, with traps, fallback routes, hidden caches of supplies, all while Soli, small and silent, watched him with something dangerously close to faith in her eyes. And as the crawler's systems began detecting faint tremors, disturbances too regular to be wind, Elias knew they were out of time. Whatever was coming had found them, and when the confrontation arrived, it wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be fair. But it would be on his terms, and no matter what else, Soli would not burn again. The sky above Valdar 9 cracked open without warning on the 9th day, a thunderless shatter of light as 3 sleek vessels tore through the atmosphere like blades, leaving trails of burning white that scarred the already tortured heavens. And Elias knew, as he felt the pressure shift around his sandcrawler, and saw the sensors blink red in a pattern he hadn't seen since the Outer Rebellion skirmishes of the series' Gate conflict, that the final act had arrived. Not the slow chase of drones or reconnaissance flashes, but the real thing. Boots, steel, orbital eyes and trackers sweeping with full intent to extract, reclaim, or destroy what had slipped through their fingers. And as he shut down all exterior power signatures and brought the crawler into its deep burial mode, activating the ground dispersal vents to mimic a cave-in, he turned to Sully, who had already climbed into the hidden storage panel without a word, curling into a ball no wider than a pack of gear, and looked at her for a long moment, unsure if the ache in his chest was fear or something far more dangerous. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stared at him with those glittering eyes like fragments of a dying star, and it hit him with the full force of something ancient. She trusted him, not because she had reason to, not because she even fully understood what he was, but because in a galaxy that had burned her to the bone, he had not looked away. He sealed the hatch over her with shaking hands, laid a decoy cover above it, and armed every trap and pulse mine within a 300-meter radius, then donned his old armor, the one he hadn't worn since he walked away from the Sovereign. Fleet court-martial, black and red, scarred at the shoulder where a plasma burst had nearly taken his arm, a ghost of a uniform that once meant order and now meant only war, and waited, the only heartbeat inside a steel coffin buried under the skin of a world too cruel for forgiveness. The first landing was precise, silent, professional, no fanfare, no chaos. 3 figures in anti-environment suits stepped onto the sand, their helmets sealed, visors shimmering with scanner feeds, moving with practiced synchronicity as they began circling the crawler's location with devices Elias recognized, flux thermals, capable of picking up the heat signature of a lizard 3 meters below ground, let alone the faint breath of a child. And though the crawler's shell was cooled and masked, it wouldn't hold forever. Elias gritted his teeth and waited until the moment the lead figure extended a scanner toward the rear hatch. He triggered the first pulse mine. A flash, a roar. Sand turned to glass in a shockwave of heat and static, hurling the soldiers back. One didn't rise again. Armor scorched and fused, while the other 2 scrambled for cover as alarms burst into their headsets. Elias was already moving, silent and lethal, emerging from a side panel of the crawler like a revenant, plasma rifle slung tight to his chest, firing once, twice, clean, efficient shots that took out their shoulder relays and kept them alive but useless. He dragged one behind a dune, pinned the other, and pressed the muzzle to their helmet. "Who sent you?" he snarled. The response came not from the soldier, but from the comms unit still active on their suit. A cold, feminine voice, precise and without breath. "Return the asset. There will be no negotiation." Elias recognized the voice, not the person, but the tone. Synthetic. Command issued. This wasn't a rescue op. This was retrieval protocol. The girl wasn't just important. She was owned. Somewhere, some species or government or hidden faction had built or bred her, and they wanted her back not as a daughter, but as property. Elias's stomach turned. He fired again, non-lethal, into the joint panel of the soldier's armor. Then, melted their comms unit before they could trace the signal bounce. He knew more were coming. He had minutes, maybe. He returned to the crawler, reopened the hatch where Sully lay in silence, and for the first time since he found her, she reached for him, arms trembling, eyes wide, not with fear, but understanding. "They found us," she whispered. "You can't stop them." "We can run," he said, even as the words tasted like ash. "No," she said quietly, her voice threading with pain and wisdom beyond her age. "They always find me. They find what's broken." Elias crouched beside her, cupping her small face in his calloused hands. And for a long moment he looked into her and saw not a child, but a story. One written in fire and silence, in worlds she couldn't name and choices she hadn't made, and he made a decision then, a terrible, final decision that would mark him for the rest of his days. "Then we don't run," he said. "We end it." He carried her to the pilot seat, wrapped her in his thickest exocoat, and activated the crawler's long-dormant emergency drive core, a nuclear burst system that could only be triggered manually, with a proximity tether linked to his biosignature. It was suicide. It was salvation. It was the only way to erase them. "There's an outpost 30 kilometers north," he said, pressing a beacon chip into her small hand. "Desert scavengers, not soldiers. They'll keep you safe. You walk at night, only at night. You hide if you see ships, and you don't say your name to anyone, not even them. Just tell them Elias Rain sent you." Soli didn't argue, didn't scream. She simply stared at him, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his in a gesture so heartbreakingly intimate, he felt something shatter inside. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." He smiled then, just once, and opened the rear hatch. The desert wind howled in, hot and cruel, and he lifted her down with hands that no longer trembled, setting her feet onto the path he'd cleared in the dunes. She turned once, stared at him, then disappeared into the storm, her small figure swallowed by golden light. When the next wave of soldiers descended, drawn by tracer code and heat spikes he had deliberately leaked, they found Elias Rain standing alone beside his crawler, weapon lowered, armor glinting like a relic of a forgotten war. "You're too late," he said, and triggered the core. The explosion lit the sky for 7 minutes. No one found wreckage. No one found him. But 3 weeks later, a scavenger caravan took in a girl with strange eyes who spoke little, never cried, and carried a chip with a name none of them had heard before, but all would come to remember: Elias Rain. And so she lived, not as a weapon, not as an experiment, but as a child who had been burned by 2 suns and saved by a human who gave everything so she could feel the cold, beautiful touch of night again.